The biggest lie in religion was not that God is far away. It was that you needed permission to reach what was already trying to reach you. Let that sink in before anything else. You were told to pray upward, obey outward, and wait patiently, while the deepest part of you stayed starving, untouched, and quietly aware that something was wrong with the whole arrangement. And that feeling was not rebellion, it was recognition. Buried under doctrine, translation, and centuries of control was a teaching the church could never afford to leave intact. That direct contact with the living source was not symbolic, not distant, and not reserved for priests. It could be triggered. It could be practiced. It could happen in an ordinary room, not through belief alone, not through empty ritual. Through a real practice involving smoke, breath, focused attention, and one sacred substance that was turned into decoration so nobody would recognize it as a tool. And the reason it was buried is simple. A person who can touch the source directly is almost impossible to manage. If something in you already knows this is true, stay with this channel. Subscribe like someone refusing substitutes. Turn on notifications if you want the next transmission before the signal gets buried under noise again. Most people think the Gnostic divide was just about ideas, one group saying one thing about God, another group saying something else. That is too soft, too clean. The real divide was this: source versus counterfeit. Living fullness versus managed reality. Direct knowing versus controlled access. The Gnostics were dangerous because they did not just question the world. They questioned the maker of the world as it appears. They said something almost nobody is willing to say out loud, even now. This system feels wrong because something in it is wrong. Not just politics. Not just culture. Not just your childhood wounds. The structure itself carries distortion. And if you have spent years feeling like this place is slightly off, like something in life never quite seals, never quite satisfies, never quite tells the truth, that is not weakness. That is not mental drama. That may be the spark in you refusing to mistake the prison for home. The old texts do not speak like polite theology. They speak like people trying to remember under pressure. In the Apocryphon of John, in the Gospel of Thomas, in the Gospel of Mary, in fragments scattered through Nag Hammadi, you can feel it. You can feel people reaching around the official story, trying to say, no, the real work was never simple obedience. The real work was waking up inside a counterfeit order without letting that order define your soul. That is why the enemy had to be established so early. Empire needed a god that looked like control. Priests needed a path that ran through them. Scribes needed the mystery reduced to rule. And later councils did what power always does. They kept what disciplines the crowd. They weakened what liberates the individual. They preserved belief. They blurred technique. They honored symbolism. They buried activation. That is why you can grow up hearing the name of Jesus for years and still never once feel that the deepest room in you has been entered, because information was left standing while contact was cut. And you know this at a bodily level. You know it in that strange fatigue that shows up even when life looks normal. You know it in the way achievement can still feel hollow. You know it in that private homesickness you cannot explain to people who seem perfectly adjusted to this world. There are people who fit here too easily, and then there are people who never fully did. You may be one of the second kind, not better, not more special in the cheap ego sense, just harder to sedate, harder to seal off, harder to convince that numbness is peace. That is why you are here. Not by accident, not because an algorithm randomly threw this at you. Something in you has been circling this tension for a long time, a feeling that religion talked around the wound but never reached it. A feeling that prayer often stopped at the ceiling. A feeling that this world demands your compliance but never explains the ache. Gnosticism does not start by flattering that feeling. It starts by naming it. The world of the demiurge is not the fullness. The counterfeit wants management, not awakening, and the first payoff is not just a new belief. It is this. The hidden teaching included a way to change the atmosphere of a room, sharpen perception fast, and make counterfeit signals easier to detect inside your own body. That changes everything. Because once the issue is perception, not mere doctrine, then practice matters more than slogans. And once practice matters, you start asking a dangerous question. What exactly was removed? What was once done, taught, whispered, enacted, breathed, or burned in private gatherings that made direct experience possible? This is where people get nervous, because they prefer hidden teachings to stay safely symbolic. They like the mood of secrecy, but not the implications of it. But the old world was full of material practices tied to spiritual states: oil, smoke, breath, fasting, silence, vigil, repetition, fragrance, sacred space, attention. Nobody in the ancient world thought the human nervous system was irrelevant to revelation. They understood something modern religion often pretends not to understand. Consciousness has conditions. Atmosphere matters. Rhythm matters. The body matters. The threshold between ordinary perception and deeper perception is not crossed by opinion alone. And the element that was stripped of its force, turned into ceremony, and hidden in plain sight was frankincense. The forgotten tool was frankincense, not as perfume, not as mood, as a threshold substance. Most people hear that word and their mind goes straight to holiday decoration, church incense, something ceremonial, old, distant, harmless. That is exactly how a living tool gets neutralized. It gets turned into background mood, a prop, a scent, something sentimental. In older currents, frankincense was not ambience. It was used to alter the nervous system's relationship to space, to quiet the scatter, to change the feel of a room, to reduce psychic noise, to make subtle perception easier to notice, not theater. Function. Frankincense was not there to make sacred space smell sacred. It was there to help human attention stop bracing long enough to perceive what ordinary agitation keeps hidden. And once you see that, the famous story changes shape. The Magi bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the child stops looking like decorative symbolism and starts looking like encoded recognition. Not only honor, preparation, not just a gift fit for a king, but substances fit for a mission, a remembered technology hidden in plain sight. And before your mind rushes to object, slow down and notice how quickly modern people reject ancient technique while accepting modern manipulation every day. You already know substances affect state. You already know environment affects mind. You already know scent can alter memory, emotion, and attention within seconds. So, the claim that ritual fragrance may have played a real role in sacred consciousness is not absurd. The absurd thing is pretending the ancients, who spent their lives studying states of soul, somehow never noticed what certain materials did in enclosed sacred space. In the Gospel of Philip, anointing is treated as something more than surface rite. In the Gospel of Mary, what survives points to ascent beyond hostile powers. In Pistis Sophia, light, atmosphere, and revelation are constantly bound together. And in the general texture of Gnostic thought, the issue is always contact. How does the spark remember its origin under pressure from a false order? That is the real question, not how to become more respectable. Not how to fit in, how to remember. And memory in the Gnostic sense is not just recall, it is reactivation. It is the moment something inside you hears truth and stops negotiating. That is why the central line matters so much. Source or counterfeit. Keep that in front of you, and almost every part of this opens. When a practice leads you deeper into dependency, fear, ego, inflation, or theatrical performance, that is counterfeit. When a practice strips noise, sharpens inner truth, makes falseness harder to tolerate, and returns you to a quiet that feels older than your personality, you are getting closer to source. That is the test. Not branding, not costume, not who approves of it. If part of you wants to dismiss this, delay it, laugh it off, or turn it back into metaphor, pay attention. Resistance gets loudest right before a managed pattern starts losing control. Watch what happens the moment you decide to test this seriously. Distraction will rise, doubt will get louder. The mind will suddenly become busy. That does not always mean you are wrong. Sometimes it means something false has noticed. It is losing ground. Maybe part of you is thinking this sounds too extreme, too conspiratorial, too much. But that reaction can also come from years of being trained to trust only what passes through sanctioned language. The problem is, sanctioned language often exists to drain force from truth. It keeps things technically available, but existentially unreachable. It lets you hear words like spirit, prayer, grace, light, and salvation your whole life, without ever being handed the missing key. How these truths become perceptible rather than merely admirable. And here the whole frame changes. What looked like theology was also survival knowledge. What looked like symbolic religion was, in part, a coded manual for maintaining contact under occupation. That is the shift. The hidden teaching was not hidden because it was decorative, it was hidden because it worked. Once you realize that, the old materials stop looking like dead texts and start feeling like residue left by people trying to preserve a line through suppression. And that hits hard when it drops from history into your own life, because the counterfeit is not just out there in institutions or ancient councils. It moves inside ordinary days. It shows up as chronic distraction, numb scrolling, shame loops, the low-grade exhaustion that keeps you too dull to ask better questions, the voice that says, you are too broken, too late, too impure, too inconsistent to touch anything real. The loneliness of feeling something true, but not being able to say it in rooms where everyone is committed to the surface. The grief of sensing your life could open more fully, but not knowing what door you keep missing. This is the point where history stops feeling old and starts feeling personal enough to hurt. This is where some people stop listening like spectators and realize the subject was never history alone. It was their own life, finally being named. You were not just anxious, you were exiled at the level of attention. You were not just tired, you were overexposed to counterfeit signals. You were not just spiritually dry, You were taught forms that often left your deepest layer untouched, and some part of you has known this for years, maybe since childhood. Maybe every time you walked out of a holy place feeling more managed than met. Maybe every time you tried to pray and felt language go dead in your mouth. Maybe every time life looked full from the outside, but inside you kept hearing one sentence: "This cannot be all." If you recognized yourself here, write the sentence you usually keep hidden. Let it sit there like proof that the signal reached you, not to perform, to mark recognition. The hidden practice matters here, not because a resin is going to save you on its own, but because it exposes a law that reaches far past one substance. The soul remembers better in a cleared field. Frankincense, in that sense, is not the destination. It is a threshold tool, a way of setting conditions, a way of saying the room is no longer casual, the senses are no longer scattered, the body is no longer given entirely to noise. In older practice, this mattered because false powers feed on confusion, agitation, fragmentation, and unconscious repetition. The archons in Gnostic thought are not just cartoon demons. They are forces of fixation, imitation, interference, and spiritual amnesia. They keep the spark busy, reactive, self-forgetting. So anything that weakens that hold will feel strangely simple and strangely forbidden at the same time. Silence, real silence, breath used with intent, refusal to scatter attention, fragrance that signals the nervous system to stop bracing, a room deliberately turned into a site of recollection. Notice how ordinary that sounds. Notice how dangerous it becomes anyway. Because the counterfeit system does not only fear dramatic rebellion, it fears recovered inwardness. It fears a person who can sit still long enough to detect what is false. It fears a human being whose inner life is no longer fully available for harvesting. That is why this is bigger than ancient ritual. It reaches into relationships, work, and daily survival. A counterfeit world trains you to betray your own signal in small ways until that betrayal feels normal. Laugh when you should leave, stay when you should speak, numb when you should grieve. Perform when you should tell the truth. Keep answering messages, keep scrolling, keep consuming, keep explaining, keep adjusting, and call that life. Then one day you wake up spiritually starved and wonder what happened. This is what happened. Your attention became colonized. Your body became a site of management. Your longing was reclassified as dysfunction. Your homesickness for the fullness was renamed depression, overthinking, immaturity, lack of gratitude, anything but what it was. And once that naming sticks, the counterfeit has a huge advantage. Because now the symptoms of exile get treated as personal failure instead of metaphysical alarm. This is why practices that return you to direct perception matter so much. Lighting frankincense with intention, entering silence, feeling the room shift, noticing your thoughts slow, noticing your chest unclench, noticing that some part of you has been waiting for this exact kind of stillness for years. That is not quaint ritual. That is a crack in the management system. Do it in a room you can keep private for at least half an hour. Cut the bright light. Use real frankincense resin if you can, not a random scented stick. Sit down before you light it and get quiet on purpose. Let your breathing slow. Let the room stop being casual. Then light the resin, stay still, and keep your attention on what changes first. The air, your chest, the pressure in the room, the drop in mental noise. Do not rush to interpret it. Notice it. For 7 nights in a row, do the same thing at the same hour, if you can. Same room, same stillness, same intention. That is how you stop treating this like a mood and start treating it like contact. And when the room settles, say one line out loud, slowly, like you mean it. I belong to the source, not the imitation. Say it plainly. Source, not counterfeit, not as poetry, as alignment. You will know something changed by the contrast. The room will feel less casual. Your thoughts will stop fighting for center stage. Your chest may loosen before your mind agrees with any of this. You may notice that silence suddenly feels inhabited instead of empty. You may open your eyes and feel that ordinary things look slightly less dead. Do not romanticize it, just notice it. The first signs are usually simple: less inner noise, more pressure in the present moment, more irritation toward what feels fake, more relief than you expected. Sometimes that is enough to tell you the room is no longer running on the same signal. And once this starts becoming real, the effects do not stay in the room. You start noticing which conversations leave residue in you, which places keep you dull, which people need your confusion, which habits were never neutral, which desires were borrowed, which forms of success only worked because you were disconnected from yourself. You may start seeing which relationships depend on your confusion. You may notice how many environments profit from your fragmentation. You may feel your old appetite for constant stimulation drop because it begins to taste false. You may stop mistaking stress for importance. You may realize that shame has been one of the counterfeit's favorite tools, because shame keeps the spark turned against itself. And once that begins to lift, even a little, people around you can feel it. Not always consciously, but they feel that you are harder to bend, harder to hook, less willing to live from borrowed signals. This is also why some people panic when others start becoming inwardly clear. They can tolerate your pain more easily than your perception. Your confusion kept old systems stable. Your clarity does not. And yes, that can cost you things. Some bonds will thin out. Some roles will stop fitting. Some forms of belonging will die. But what dies is often what fed on your disconnection. What stays has a chance to become real. That is the expansion most people are not prepared for. Gnosis is not a mood. It reorganizes your life around what your soul can no longer unknow. So, when we talk about an erased teaching tied to sacred smoke, we are not talking about aesthetic spirituality. We are talking about a practice that may help a person feel, maybe for the first time in years, that they are not sealed inside the counterfeit, that there is still signal, that source has not gone silent, that the spark is not dead, only buried under interference. And once a person truly feels that, even once, daily life stops looking the same. Work becomes a question. Desire becomes a question. Obedience becomes a question. The story you were given about success becomes a question, because now there is a deeper reference point inside you. That is what the system fears most, not believers, but rememberers. So no, the point is not to romanticize one resin or pretend every ancient claim must be taken literally. The point is sharper than that. The point is that direct contact was once treated as real, practical, and worth protecting, and much of what followed worked very hard to make sure you would inherit symbols without access, devotion without activation, language without encounter. That is the theft. And if you have been feeling the theft for years without naming it, This may be why this hit you so hard. When people say the world is fine and your discomfort is the problem, remember the axis: source or counterfeit, signal or interference, fullness or prison. Use it. Bring it into ordinary moments. Ask it when you leave a conversation feeling drained. Ask it when your attention gets hijacked. Ask it when shame tells you to shrink. Ask it when a spiritual message makes you more dependent instead of more inwardly clear. The old Gnostics were not asking for blind rebellion. They were asking for discernment, sharp enough to tell living water from managed thirst. And that discernment is intimate. It is not abstract. It lives in the body, the breath, the atmosphere, the conscience, the ache, the moment when you suddenly know, without needing anyone to approve it, that something is true. That is why the conclusion of this matters on both a massive and personal scale. Massive, because if the Gnostics were right, then the deepest human struggle is not simply moral failure. It is amnesia inside a distorted order. Personal, because this is not happening to humanity in general. It is happening inside your attention, your relationships, your fear, your longing, your room, your nights, your private thoughts. The next move is not grand, it is exact. Create a space that is not casual. Bring in frankincense if you feel called to test the old current for yourself. Sit down. Let the room change. Let your body stop performing. Let the counterfeit noise show itself by contrast. And listen for what remains when interference drops. Not fantasy, not self-hypnosis, recognition. If this named something real in you, write this below. I know the difference now. If this reached you, leave one line below. Signal over counterfeit. If this hit the thing you have felt for years, write, I was never crazy for feeling the fracture. And stay with this channel if you are done letting the counterfeit narrate reality for you. Subscribe like a refusal. Turn on notifications if you want the next transmission before it gets softened, translated, and made safe again. Because what comes next goes further into the buried line between Jesus and the hidden initiatory teachings around anointing, oil, and the impossible saying that was never meant to be read as metaphor alone. There is a deeper layer under this one, and once that door opens, the whole map changes again.